This week on The Sceptic,
Kemi Badenoch has many obvious talents, and I'm optimistic that, she should be 5-10 points ahead in the polls by this time next year. But if she isn't, Tory MPs will start getting twitchy.
I speak to William Atkinson, assistant editor at Conservative Home, on Kemi Badenoch's victory in the Tory leadership election and her prospects as leader. Conservative peer, venture capitalist and author of Return to Growth, Jon Moynihan, joins me to discuss Rachel Reeves' tax-bonanza budget.
Every government, including the Labour government, agree that growth is promoted by relatively small government, low levels of taxes, and in particular low levels of regulation. And yet the Rachel Reeves budget did precisely the opposite of those three things.
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined by Harry Miller, former police officer and founder of Fair Cop, who gives us his frank assessment of the Chris Cabba case.
How, in what way could it have been murder? He got what he deserved in that moment. He got precisely what he deserved.
And why unfounded witch hunts against officers are so damaging for police morale.
Police are going to work absolutely terrified that they are going to find themselves punished for simply doing their job.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. But first, a message from our sponsor. Have you ever wondered what happened to the legendary Chuck Norris? I recently saw a video he made, and I was shocked. More than 50 years after taking on Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon, he's now in his 80s and still kicking ass, working out and staying active. He says he's stronger, can work out longer, and even has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He says he still feels like he's in his 50s. He did this by making just one change. His wife even started doing this one thing too, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger, her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. So how did he do it? Well, Chuck made a special video that explains everything, which you can watch by going to chuckdefense.com/daily, or by clicking the link below this video. It could change the way you think about your health. Once again, that's chuckdefense.com/daily, and click on the link in the description below to watch the video now. You won't believe how simple it is. Just a reminder, the legendary Chuck Norris is a whopping 84 years old and yet has more energy than me. He discovered he could create dramatic changes to his health simply by focusing on 3 things that sabotage our bodies as we age. See how he did it by clicking the link in the description below, chuckdefense.com/daily. Hello and welcome to episode 18 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, after a seemingly interminable leadership contest, Kemi Badenoch is the new leader of the Conservative Party. On a 72% turnout of the dwindling ranks of Tory members, Badenoch secured 53,806 votes, beating the 41,000 of her rival, Robert Jenrick, by 13 percentage points. The world's oldest party has made its choice. But now the MP for North West Essex must take on the far harder task of pitching herself to the country at large. Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by William Atkinson, assistant editor at Conservative Home. Welcome to The Sceptic, William.
Hello.
Okay, so Kemi Badenoch has been elected Conservative leader. Now, let's talk about the implications of that in a second. But first, let's talk about the race, shall we? And, some people said it could have gone on for an entire year. That was one of the suggestions. So it wasn't quite as long as that, but it did still feel pretty long. It certainly wasn't a short contest. And so, what did you make of the contest overall? And in particular, I suppose, what was your perspective on it from inside the tent at Conservative Home?
Well, it was an interesting structure to the contest. Not only in terms of the sort of actual length of it, but by this way that they chose to apportion various different segments. So, for example, I think the sort of voting, the MPs round, at least, sort of took place over a sort of month or two. Then we had party conference. Then we had another round of MPs voting. And the actual round by which the candidates would go out and see the members who would have the choice between the final two only lasted 2 and a bit weeks. And so it seemed like quite an odd structure from that perspective, because you'd think that, especially in a parliamentary party of only 121 MPs, most MPs knew enough about the 6 candidates that we started off with to be able to vote quite rapidly. I don't really see why they needed that large amount of time. And actually, if you wanted to have a genuine contest that allowed members to see as much of the two candidates as possible, then the extended part should have been the final members round. But I think the most interesting element for us was that it was quite a stagnant contest for the first few months. And then party conference actually proved to be quite interesting. And I think at various points over these sort of 3 or 4 days, sort of Badenoch, James Cleverly and Robert Jenrick seemed to emerge as the front runner. But aside from that, Kemi Badenoch has been the front runner to be the next leader of the Conservative Party since the summer of 2022. And despite all the heat and light that might have been generated over the last few months, she is now the leader of the Conservative Party. So in the wise words of Chud Jack, nothing ever really happens.
Yes, and so obviously one particular feature of this leadership race was that this yellow card system, so there's supposed to be no blue-on-blue attacks by the candidates on each other, although admittedly Badenoch did seem to flout this on the final weekend of the vote. But that meant, there was little candidate scrutiny of each other, and in the 2-week period of the membership vote, there was notably no actual head-to-head debate between the candidates. There was only the GB News debate, which was just sort of 1 hour separately, one after the other. And so do you feel there was sufficient scrutiny on the candidates during this whole process?
No, I don't, actually. I would have quite liked to see a debate. Now I see why various different candidates in CCHQ themselves were rather sceptical of the idea of having a head-to-head debate, because they all remember what happened in sort of 2022, where there were various sort of slanging matches between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak that did neither candidate many favours and did the image of the party itself an awful lot of damage. On the other hand, one of these people was going to be leader of the opposition, and it would have been quite good for the two of them to actually be able to pose questions to each other. After all, they hope to be doing PMQs for at least the next 4 or 5 years, and so they should have the ability to actually handle a back and forth debate. So it was a shame that we didn't get a debate between the two candidates. I mean, it was very obvious why we didn't have a debate. It was not only because CCHQ felt a bit for it, but it's because Kemi Badenoch didn't want to do one. A bit like Labour with their Ming Vase strategy earlier this year. Being the front runner meant that Kemi Badenoch had every incentive to avoid, a debate, to do as many members' events as she possibly could, to do lots of long format interviews. She only started to do that stuff in the last week when it looked like the vote might actually be squeezed. And so I think that is a shame. And I think it actually starts Kemi off on the back foot because, for somebody who's created a reputation for herself as somebody who's willing to get into a scrap, who's willing to stand up for her principles, surely she should be able to do that for an hour or two on the BBC. And the fact that she was unwilling to do that, I think, is a genuine shame.
And so what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the candidates that could have been exposed a bit more during the campaign, do you think? And I suppose particularly of Badenoch, given that she's won.
Yeah, I think Kemi's strengths have been well rehearsed. She knows her own mind. She's a confident performer at both the dispatch box and on television. Her weaknesses have also been sort of well enunciated, which is that sometimes her mouth can run away with itself. She has a habit of rubbing a few colleagues up the wrong way. And there's a worry that especially emerged towards the end of this campaign, that she talks an awful lot about returning to first principles and saying, it's important to tell hard truths and to have a plan with a capital P. But people turn around and say, well, there's actually very obvious reasons and policy reasons why the Conservatives lost the last election. Living standards were down, NHS waiting lists were up, and we lost total control of immigration. And immigration especially is an existential issue for the future of the Conservative Party. The success of reform entirely sort of derived from our unwillingness to control and reduce numbers, as we promised in the 2019 manifesto. My friend Gavin Rice has done lots of good work at Onwards and then wrote a series for us on it, on basically why voters switched away from the Conservatives. And even voters who went to the Lib Dems, for example, their number one issue was our failure on migration. And it was very clear throughout Robert Jenrick's campaign that having resigned as immigration minister, having written that great paper for the Centre for Policy Studies earlier this year, that this was a man who was genuinely committed to getting numbers down to the tens and thousands, if not lower. And Kemi Badenoch sort of ummed and erred on immigration throughout her campaign and was unwilling to sort of commit herself to a specific target. I think she genuinely believes that immigration got too high under the last Conservative government, and any future Conservative government would not be able to allow that to happen again. But what I worry is that she doesn't take this issue sufficiently seriously. And unlike Jenrick, she isn't willing to sort of get a headline-grabbing policy like leading the EACO charge to try and outflank Nigel Farage. And what we'll see over the next year or two is that if Reform's numbers continue to tick up, if they do quite well in the local elections next year, if they manage to actually establish some form of national infrastructure, the Conservative vote will continue to be squeezed. And that's not only a sort of issue for the party's future, but for Kemi's. And we saw in 2019 where the performance of the Brexit Party at the European elections sort of drove the Conservative Party to smash the glass, sort of branded Boris Johnson. And it's entirely possible that if Kemi doesn't make enough headway against Reform and relatively soon, we might be doing this all over again in 2 or 3 years' time, which, from somebody who at my time at Conservative Home has now gone through 3 Conservative leadership elections, is not something I really want to be doing in the near future.
And so on that question of the ECHR, and particularly with Jenrick potentially lurking in the background as a potential leader if her leadership doesn't go so well, what should her approach be towards that signal issue of the ECHR and immigration more broadly? And how should she play it with respect to Jenrick himself?
Well, I think it would be very difficult on that latter point for her now to install Robert Jenrick as a shadow Home Secretary. Because even though, Jenrick has previous experience at the Home Office and made immigration and more broadly sort of the issues sort of deriving from it central to his campaign, there are sufficient differences between the two candidates on how that issue should be approached that I think it wouldn't be sustainable for him then to be shadow Home Secretary. Because if he said to her, well, I'll only be shadow Home Secretary if you'll sort of commit to leaving the ECHR, and she's just sort of won a campaign on the basis that she was unwilling to leave the ECHR or make an explicit commitment to do so, I can't see that being sustainable. So I imagine, if he and sources close to him have expressed a willingness to serve in Kemi's shadow cabinet, and I think he should definitely want to, and she should definitely want to have him, because otherwise that's somebody with the support of 40-odd MPs on the backbenches and a very small parliamentary party who could potentially make trouble. I think it's probably more likely that he'll get something like, say, shadow foreign secretary, because I think the two of them are actually quite closely aligned on foreign policy. It didn't really play much of a role during the leadership election. And it would mean that Jenrick had a sort of large and prominent role, but not one in which he made, he had clear policy tensions with Kemi. So that's my sort of my 2 pence. She tries to put her shadow cabinet together. Aside from that, on the sort of issue of the ECHR itself, I think it's genuinely unclear what Kemi's final policy will be, because she's committed at the moment to having, this big think. It was sort of, we call it sort of Kemi's. I think it's been called Kemi's big think as to what the party's future direction should be. And she says, leaving the ECHR may be necessary to control illegal migration, but it's not sufficient. We have problems with the courts at home, for example, in blocking the Rwanda policy. And we also have sort of other sort of problems that do with the structural capacity of the Home Office, and her broader sort of point about the way that the Whitehall machine doesn't actually work and is sort of fundamentally rigged in favour of using human quantitative easing to make the Treasury sort of figures add up every budget. And all of that needs to be tackled. And I agree with that. And I think there's an awful lot to that analysis. But my personal view is that we should leave the ECHR. And I would hope that once Kemi's big think sort of concludes, she would agree with Jenrick on this issue and might even be willing to reshuffle him into the position of her shadow Home Secretary. Who knows?
Yeah, and so one of the particular questions there on the ECHR and the sort of ability to purity signal your right-wing credentials on immigration is Reform. And it was notable that on the day of Badenoch's election, Reform were almost crowing about it, coming out with this line, it's more of the same, it's more of the same. And they really seemed to be very pleased, in fact, they hadn't been Jenrick. Because, of course, during the campaign, the only attack line that Nigel Farage was able to kind of bring out about Jenrick was when he said he wanted to leave the ECHR, was that he wasn't committed to it, which really demonstrated how Jenrick's line on that had, outflanked Reform from the right. And so, what will be the effect of Badenoch's leadership, do you think, on the relationship between Reform and the Tories?
I think, I would say this, but it is early days. So we will see whether Badenoch can quickly establish herself as somebody who is not only taken sort of credibly on the issue of migration, or is seen as credible, I should say, on the issue of migration, but as someone who can actually be the departure from the status quo that I think voters have been crying out for a very long time. They hate us, and we failed very obviously on the sort of major issues of living standards, NHS and immigration, as I outlined earlier. And Labour are failing in exactly the same way. Voters voted to sort of fundamentally change the political status quo in 2016 when they voted to leave the European Union. They voted for Boris Johnson's, changed Conservative Party, to sort of nick Keir Starmer's phrasing, in 2019. And then we proved just to be obsessed with psychodrama and failing in all the traditional ways, as previous Conservative governments had been. We sort of lost those voters that we'd gained in 2019 and on the back of the Brexit referendum this summer. And any future path to victory for the Conservative Party means reuniting that Vote Leave coalition. But a basic problem that we have is that voters don't trust us to do that. Time and time again, they voted for the Conservative Party to fundamentally change itself, to reorientate itself towards those voters, I think that sometimes sort of condescendingly called left behind voters, but at least the sort of voters that we know geographically tend to be in the North, the Midlands, hadn't previously voted Conservative in large numbers, etc. And we fundamentally failed to do so. And if Kemi proves unable to win back those voters quite rapidly, not only will her own leadership be under threat, but I think Nigel Farage is the natural sort of outlet for those voters, not only because many of them will have voted to leave the European Union, indeed the vast majority will have voted to leave the European Union, but because we saw Reform come second to Labour in about 90 seats at the last election. And as Labour's numbers go down, as they lose more by-elections to Reform in places like Wolverhampton, such as last week, Reform will continue to emerge as a credible national political force. And they will take votes from both major parties. And by the next election, I think we will have an unprecedented opportunity, or there will be an unprecedented opportunity, because I say this obviously as somebody who wants the Conservative Party to form the next government, but there will be an unprecedented opportunity to smash the two-party duopoly as it's existed since the Second World War. And Reform at the moment are the obvious beneficiary of that. We'll see if Dominic Cummings ever gets his start-up party off the ground. I can't really see the sort of voters of the Red Wall flocking en masse to Ed Davey. But yeah, the Reform question is existential. And I would rather a situation where the Conservatives, after the next election, form a government, with a majority. But if we're not able to make enough headway against Reform while also gaining votes from Labour, you may end up with a situation where you have a hung parliament and we become reliant on Reform anyway. And any Conservative leader should want to be able to sufficiently outflank Reform and to take their voters, just as Boris Johnson did in 2019 compared to the European elections earlier that year, as to make Reform irrelevant. And I worry that because Kemi doesn't have a clearer pitch on migration, which is the central fundamental issue, that she was not as able to do that, or at least not as readily able to do that as Robert Jenrick was. And so we'll see. She's only been leader for 48 hours, but I'd say that's something that she needs to establish very early on, or both the position of the Conservative Party and her own personal position are going to be very much at risk.
And of course, immigration is an existential issue for the Tories in the upcoming electoral cycle. But one of the other focuses recently has been, which I'm very keen to get your take on, is this issue of identity politics. And of course, Badenoch, has styled herself as an anti-woke politician, an anti-identity politics politician. And yet it was notable, wasn't it, that, as soon as she won and it was announced by the Tory chair, Bob Blackman, the first thing he said was, well, she was a woman, wasn't that good? And in fact, she was a black woman as well, and wasn't that wonderful?
Therefore, I give notice that Kemi Badenoch is elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. I welcome her to the stage. And it's great, isn't it great that we've got another female leader? And isn't it great that we're the first party to have a black leader of the party? Another glass ceiling shattered.
And so one of the arguments that's been made, in fact, by Toby Young, is also that because she's black, she has a certain authority to speak on culture war issues. And, because the left can't really attack her as racist, which is their go-to line. But then at the same time, we do see this sort of refracted identity politics in the Conservative Party. We saw it with Bob Blackman, celebrating Badenoch's identity. And that does actually irk people in the opposite direction at times as well. Because, really, you shouldn't be making the left's argument for it, should you? You should be talking about meritocracy. And Badenoch herself has been a bit inconsistent on this issue, as in fact I wrote in The Spectator during the leadership campaign, which I know you read. And so, what do you make of this issue in general? And in particular, how careful should the Tories be about really trying to beat the left here at its own game?
Yes, I must say I thought your piece was very good on this. And I would also have to say that, alas, I think your editor's comments on it are quite frankly nonsense. The idea that simply because you come from an ethnic minority, the left won't try to brand you as bigoted or racist because you simply come from the right of politics is, as I say, nonsense. I mean, look at the way that the left treated Suella Braverman or Rishi Sunak, to see that simply being an ethnic minority is not enough to shield you from attack. I mean, look, actually, I think it was Rishi Sunak who put this issue very well in his party conference speech back in 2023, when he said, one of the many things that he liked about modern Britain was that he was standard our sort of first British Asian prime minister, and it just wasn't a big deal. Unlike in the United States, we neither was sort of had a sort of bit. So with the United States with Obama, for example, we didn't make a big deal or sort of self-flagellate over our historical approach to race relations, or make a big deal out of the fact that we now had, an ethnic minority leader. And my natural approach is to say the same about, the Conservative Party. It might give us, deep down a slight bit of satisfaction that a Labour Party that's yet to have a female leader has now been beaten by the Tories on that front 4-0, and also a Labour Party that's never had an ethnic minority leader has now been sort of beaten by the Tories 2-0 in recent times. I don't see why we should choose to sort of fight fight in the left's territory on this one, or sort of adopt their approach to it. I always thought that the approach that we'd hope to take is one of colour blindness. I mean, it genuinely doesn't interest me or move me that the fact that Kemi Badenoch is a black woman. I view her entirely on her strength of character and her abilities as a politician. And I think it's just as reductive to sort of fetishize her race from the perspective of, isn't it wonderful that Tories now have a black leader? She can take the fight to the Labour. Like Tim Stanley, who was, again, a personal friend, but him sort of portraying him almost like a sort of dominatrix who's going up to give the left a good spanking over the issue of identity politics, is just quite weird. And it's just as weird as those online who try to pretend that she's not actually British, or she can't actually be sort of considered serious as a leader because she is black and she grew up in Nigeria. I don't think it's something that Tories should make much out of. And I was disappointed to see Bob Blackman using the language of like smashing glass ceilings and all of that, because not only does it demonstrate the terrible sort of America brain that we suffer from in British politics, but it was actually incredibly reductive. And I enjoyed Sunak saying when he left Downing Street that, again, he liked living in a country that wasn't bothered by the fact that it had a British Asian prime minister, from which it wasn't a big deal. And then Keir Starmer immediately saying outside Downing Street that the most important thing about Rishi Sunak was that he was our first British Asian prime minister. And I think it's very disappointing if the Conservative Party chooses to promote somebody on the basis of the colour of their skin rather than their abilities as a politician, which in Kemi's case are considerable, and I think of much more interest than what her background is.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things here is that question of whether we should be taking the left's argument on identity politics and turning it on its head or not, sort of seems to be split quite a lot between the younger voices on the right and the older voices. Now, generally speaking, the establishment Tory press has been pretty favourable towards Badenoch, and she hasn't really had a lot of scrutiny there, as we've discussed. And obviously she's known to be an ally of Michael Gove at The Spectator. But I mean, you're an interesting voice here, I think, because you're closely involved in that end of the Conservative Party, but you're obviously that same generation as me. You used the phrase America brained earlier, which is not something that the legacy press would be so likely to say. And so what do you make of that dynamic in general? And I suppose in particular, what do you think explains the fact that younger voices on the right, I mean, I'm not in the Tory party, but still, younger voices on the right are more aligned towards generic, whereas the older voices seem to favour Badenoch?
Yes, I think it is an interesting one. And I think this is primarily based on sort of anecdotal evidence, but also by the fact that both candidates were sort of briefing, or their teams were briefing, that Badenoch tends to do better in the sort of southeast and in London, and Jenrick tends to do better amongst not only sort of younger voters in London, but more broadly, better in the provinces, as it were, than simply in the home counties. And I think Badenoch's victory was based on the fact that she was able to pile up support from, the sort of southeast and heartland of the sort of Tory membership, which where the bulk of members are, and those members do tend to be older. And they do tend to be wealthier from the sort of work that's been done on this, admittedly a few years ago, but nonetheless probably sort of still holds true from academics like Tim Bale. And I think her unwillingness to commit on policy meant that Jenrick, who has not only sort of made lots of sort of very YIMBY-ish noises about building more homes, and is as community secretary was sort of foiled in his efforts to actually reform our sort of sclerotic planning system, but also because his willingness to sort of take immigration seriously and promise to rapidly get down numbers. I mean, appealed to a younger Tory generation that are struggling to get on the housing ladder, are struggling with the cost of living because, of course, immigration and the attendant costs of not only paying for it, but more importantly, its sort of impact on things like housing costs, which has been well documented by my friend Carl Williams at the CPS, mean that actually sort of Jenrick was the candidate making the more direct pitch to improving younger Tory sort of standards of living. And ultimately, one has to have a slight level of self-interest if one wants to sort of be a Conservative Party member, an activist. And so I think he appealed on the basis of that. And I think also, as you say, there is a generational divide between those in the Conservative Party who may get their sort of news, their commentary from sort of like organs such as the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator, GB News essentially, and sort of younger voices in the Conservative Party who are much more online, who may sort of get their information from not only sort of blogs like yourself, like your own and indeed my own, but also from like Substacks, from Twitter, from other areas in which the discourse is, I think, very different from the discourse that you see in sort of mainstream sort of Tory publications. You had in the last couple of weeks, Charles Moore and Simon Heffer, men who I both sort of greatly respect and idolised, growing up, sort of doing the traditional, oh yes, Kemi, she reminds me a bit of Maggie, doesn't she? Isn't she superb? The same sort of stuff that happened with Liz Truss 2 years ago. We see how that worked out. Whereas I think younger Conservatives are not really interested in that sort of thing. They weren't around in the 70s and 80s. Their experience of growing up politically occurs, obviously, or coming of age at least, is all post the financial crisis. Lots of them will have been at university or just left or just about to go in during COVID. They haven't really seen the good times. They've only known a Britain that is stagnant, a Britain that has very low growth, a Britain that is dependent on, human quantitative easing to make the sums add up. And I think there is a deep, deep frustration there with politics as understood and played by Tory members who tend to be well off, own their own homes, live in the South, experience the good times of the, 80s, 90s and early 2000s. And I think Jenrick was the candidate much more willing to sort of voice those fears and indeed to understand those fears. He had quite a young team around him and he spent lots of time with people like, the next generation Tories who did lots of events with them. So he understood where younger members were coming from. But, younger Tories, the Conservative Party came fifth amongst voters at 18 to 24. Being a young Tory and a young Tory member means that I'm incredibly weird and unusual in a national sense. And it also means I'm sort of weird and unusual within the Conservative Party. And if the bulk of the sort of older membership had always liked Kemi, they saw her as Maggie 2.0, that meant she always had an instinctive advantage. And so I think it was very difficult for Jenrick to try and sort of catch her up on that.
And I suppose finally, more broadly, how do you think Badenoch's leadership is going to take shape? And I suppose in maybe 3, 6 months, a year, what would be a good indicator that it's going well or that it isn't?
Well, of course, the first big test that she will face are the local elections next year. The polls are obviously the day-to-day tracker of how well she does. If she establishes a clear lead over Keir Starmer, her preferred choice to be Prime Minister, as being trusted on the economy, as well as the sort of basic voting intention polls, that would be a very good sort of metric by which to judge her performance, and one which Tory MPs will obviously be very closely allied to. But yes, the local elections are going to be her first big opportunity to actually face the voters. And if a Labour government as abysmal as this one is not losing very heavily in next year's local elections, then something's going wrong. I think in terms of within the party itself, it's her ability to unite the party around her, not in a slightly sort of trite, sort of kumbaya, let's all hold hands, isn't party unity wonderful approach that perhaps one or two candidates leaned a bit too heavily into, but more in the sense that she's got a shadow cabinet that not only sort of contains her fellow leadership candidates, but contains people who are talented from across the party, people like Neil O'Brien, for example, who backed Robert Jenrick, having previously backed her, and which genuinely seems united and pushing in a particular direction. and that is actually committed to doing this big review of what went wrong over the last 14 years, but building a new and interesting manifesto and policy prospectus. And if that has already devolved into internal fights over the ECHR, over Tory MPs getting their backs up because a department that they were a minister for, is being criticised, or their own records are sort of being pulled over the coals, and Kemi doesn't seem particularly interested in sort of massaging their egos, then I think she would already be in quite a great deal of difficulty. But the Conservative Party also has to adapt to the fact that now she's been elected, we really aren't news anymore. This was the last big news story that we're going to have until the next leadership crisis. Because Labour are the government, they're the people who are producing like 3 or 4 different policy press releases every day. They're the ones driving the headlines. They're the ones with all the power and the ability to actually, change the country. And it's our fault that, in Evelyn Waugh's phrase that we failed to put back the clock 1 second when we were in government. It's the Conservative Party's, inability to actually deliver for its sort of voters, deliver on its promises in 2019, which means that we're now in opposition. And that's something we'll have to adjust to. And I think it's something that a lot of Tory MPs will find a lot more difficult than they currently think. And I mean, when I was at the party conference a couple of months ago, it actually had quite a good atmosphere. Even though there were no lobbyists, you could actually get to the bar for once. But people had seen how badly Labour were doing. They already felt vindicated. They were enjoying having the leadership election to focus on. But if we're not making headway against Keir Starmer by next year's conference, it's going to be incredibly depressing. And the party as a whole is going to feel incredibly depressed. And that's when people start to question her leadership. And I think, as I said right at the start, Kemi Badenoch has many obvious talents, and she is somebody who focus groups have shown voters are genuinely interested in, and they want to hear more from her. And she is, she can be a very good sort of media performer, except when she starts talking about maternity leave. And I'm optimistic that, she should be 5-10 points ahead in the polls by this time next year. But if she isn't, Tory MPs will start getting twitchy. And I think that's a terrible thing for the Conservative Party because, we can't keep having like incompetent regicide after incompetent regicide. At some point we actually need to, unite around a particular leader and policy prospectus and actually get into government and bloody deliver it. But, I hope that she's able to do that and keep MPs on side. And we'll see. And I wish her all the best, especially because, if she trips and falls, it's my website that's going to have to cover that process and the attendant leadership chaos. And that's not something I really want to be doing all over again.
Okay, well, William Atkinson, thanks very much for coming on.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, there's been so much chatter in the lead up to this budget this year that it seemed like it would never arrive. Well, now it has, and if you're an employer or a farmer or a landlord or pretty much anything, it's not been pretty. In opposition, the Prime Minister pledged his government would be laser focused on growth. But will Rachel Reeves' £40 billion in tax rises really deliver that? Well, here to discuss that is Jon Moynihan, Lord Moynihan of Chelsea, OBE, former venture capitalist and chairman of the Institute of Free Trade, and of course, we can see it behind you, author of Return to Growth. Welcome to The Sceptic, Jon.
Thank you, Laurie. Good to be here.
Okay, so we had the budget last week, and let's begin at the beginning, shall we? So what were some of the highlights, if you can find any, and what were some of the lowlights? And sort of, I suppose, particularly on that key question of growth, which everyone, really agrees that we're desperately in need of.
Well, the budget was very good for my book, although not so much for the nation, because the book tries to forensically examine what allows a country's economy to grow. How do you have a growing economy? And as you indicated, all the political parties say that growth is the number one thing, that without growth, everything goes wrong. And they're quite right. But none of them seem to have any kind of understanding of what growth, what creates and underlies and promotes growth. And the book says, actually, to be fair, every government, including the Labour government, agree that growth is promoted by relatively small government, low levels of taxes, and in particular low levels of regulation. And yet the Rachel Reeves budget did precisely the opposite of those three things. It enlarged the government even beyond the very considerable enlargement that was created by Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, very unfortunate, three Conservative prime ministers who massively expanded government during their time. It raised taxes even more, and it promised more regulation. Now, it's quite fascinating that I guess we'll get on to the Liz Truss budget later, but that one had an unfunded allegedly, if you assume no dynamic impact of tax cuts, gap of 40 billion pounds. Now Rachel Reeves increased government spending by 70 million pounds and raised taxes allegedly by 40 billion pounds. But when you go through the math of it, which I'm happy to do with you, she's not going to get 40 billion pounds. She may not even get any extra billion pounds from all these increases. We'll see. And so the kind of fiscal incontinence that Rachel Reeves showed was arguably considerably greater than the Truss budget. But if indeed you can argue that the Truss budget had gaps, which is arguable. So she really went to town. Obviously, she spent a lot of money helping her constituencies, like public sector workers, giving them big raises, and protecting them in this budget from a lot of the other raises. So that was bad. But just in general, she's promoting a much bigger government than before, and she's pouring money into education and into the health service. The book shows that if you're not spending much on education and you put more money into education, then educational results go up. Great, the children of your country enter into adult life able to read and write better, able to do sums better, and so forth, better educated. But at a certain point, that stops, as the book shows, and we're spending considerably more per head than the level where that stops. So for some time now, we've been putting more money into education with no expected improvement in educational results. At the stage we're at, the kind of expenditure we've got, improving educational results comes from different things than spending more money. And to be fair to Michael Gove, the reforms he put in a decade ago and that were pushed forward for an entire decade by Nick Gibb, the great Minister for Schools, those were the ones that have improved educational results. However, only about a third of schools, in my estimation, working with a educational think tank called Parents and Teachers for Excellence, only about a third of schools have taken on those reforms, and the other ones haven't, and so educational results in those other schools haven't gone up, and putting more money into them won't help. I think that when we turn to health, not alone in saying that pouring more money into the NHS, which basically just goes into two things. One is more salaries for everybody, and the second is more administrators, doesn't have much impact on health outcomes, and our health outcomes get worse and worse, which is a tragedy for this country and quite unnecessary. So she's spending a lot of money there. She's spending a lot of money in general. That what the book shows is that if we were spending at the level that countries around the world of our wealth per capita were spending or are spending, we would spend £100 billion less, actually £112 billion less than we are spending now. just to get down to what the average country of our wealth is spending. But the average country of our wealth is spending too much anyway. If we wanted to get down to the kind of level that would allow economic growth, we'd have to be spending £300 billion less. But just to get down to that average level, we need to spend £112 billion more. We have just incontinently ramped up our spending, not to any great effect in the government, but just because it was a way of attempting to get re-elected. Well, see what that did for the Conservatives. They didn't get re-elected because governments at that level of expenditure can't grow. And if you don't grow, then people aren't seeing their wages go up. They aren't seeing jobs going up. Everything gets more precarious. And that is going to carry on. And I predicted before the budget that the budget would be such as to put us on a path maybe to have the IMF called in 5 years, just as they were called in at the end of the last big Labour fiasco, which was under Callaghan and Healey. The IMF got called in and said, right, this has got to stop.
Okay, so various different tax rises in play there, supposedly making up the sum of 40 billion, but as you say, perhaps not. And one of the ones that people are particularly angry about is the rise in national insurance. So what do you make of that? And what do you make of the tax measures in this budget more broadly?
As the budget was proceeding, I was getting a torrent of texts and emails from friends in the business community, which is, what actually creates jobs and grows the economy, saying, well, this is what it's going to do for me. And over and again, 60% of jobs are in the SME, small, medium-sized enterprise sector. It's just people, who've taken the risk of starting up a business, putting their money into it, trying to grow it. And it could be anything. It could be a small accounting firm. It could be a hairdresser's. It could be a tailor, a dry cleaner, whatever. These are people who are the entrepreneurs who start businesses, employ other people, and thus that's what grows the economy. It's not increasing the size of the NHS that grows the economy. So I was getting these messages saying, right, that's me. I'm going to have to fire 5 people. And this was from people who have employees of, say, 40 people. I'm going to have to fire 5 people. I'm going to have to go to the bank and tell them I need a different schedule to repay my loan to them because I won't have the money. And over and over again, they were saying, this is paid to my intention to hire 2 people next month or whatever. And you take those 2 people, you multiply it by a few 100,000 businesses, that's 400,000 people not getting jobs who would have gotten jobs. That's what growth or no growth means. And if you think about it, the reason why she's not going to raise 40 billion, say take the money that you're trying to charge employers for employers' NIC. Now, you might get that from Barclays Bank, but when you go down to, but even with Barclays Bank, who might be a bit too slow on the uptake to start firing people immediately, they will have lower profits because they've had to pay all this money in NIC. With lower profits, that means they pay less corporation tax. So you get less corporation tax, even though you might get more employers' NIC. But then you get down to the smaller companies, and they fire people or don't hire people. So you don't get that increase in employers' NIC you were getting, but you don't get anything. You don't get income tax from the people that were fired or were not hired. You don't get employees' NIC from them. You don't get anything from them. And that's classic dynamic Laffer-style effects of trying to increase tax rates, but not getting an increase in tax revenue. Now, the worst of it all is the impact on entrepreneurs themselves. First of all, they've abolished the non-dom tax. And I'm seeing the most absurd tweets on this. A picture of Ian Hislop looking complacent and satisfied and saying, "Oh, am I upset that Lord Rothermere will lose his non-dom status? No, I'm not. I think that's great." Well, you then Google Lord Rothermere. It's not that hard, and you find that he lives in Monaco, so he's not a non-dom. He's a non-resident who doesn't pay any tax. But Ian Hislop likes to think that Lord Rothermere, because he hates the Daily Mail, is a non-dom. He ain't. Non-doms actually pay tax until the tax on them becomes so onerous that they say, right, I'm not going to live in England anymore. I'm going to go off to Monaco or Dubai or Australia or America or anywhere else, but I'm not going to go here. Now I'm not going to pay any tax. I was, as a non-dom, paying lots of tax because non-doms, at one point I think were paying, over 10% of the UK's income tax. But if they leave, they don't pay nothing. So all these Hislopian lefties who think that the attack on non-doms is going to be a good thing are incredibly foolish, because there has been this torrent of people leaving the UK over the past half dozen years, ever since the war on enterprise, on non-doms and on UK citizens began ramping up. And Matthew Elliott, who's also in the Lords, gave a speech last week in the Lords saying he'd just been to Dubai for a conference. And what amazed him was the literally hundreds of 20-something-year-old Brits who had moved out there and who would say to him, "Oh, you've no idea how great it is here. Low taxes, low regulation. I can start up a business and get on with my life." And these are not rich non-doms. These are not even wealthy business owners. They're our future. Actually, when I was 26, they had the 3-day week in the UK. I don't know if you've even heard of that, but Edward Heath imposed that you could only go into work for 3 days a week. I was so disgusted I left the UK for 20 years. And came back. I'm committed to this country now, but I was like many people then. It was called the brain drain, and it's happening again now. Non-doms are flooding. I know 2 billionaires who I know quite well who have left the country in the last year, and who are paying huge amounts of taxes, who ain't paying that tax anymore. Now, these lefties are going, "Oh, I'm so glad, if they want to leave the country, let them." Well, mate, who's going to pay for your wonderful NHS? Who's going to pay for education? Who's going to pay all these benefits that the people claiming mental health disability are claiming right now? If the big wealthy types are all leaving the country. So I believe that the attack on wealth, on enterprise, on capital that we've seen, not just from Rachel Reeves, she's just continuing what was being done under Hunt and Sunak. I believe that attack means that 40 billion of excess of additional tax revenue she was going to get won't happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up as very little, if anything at all, in improved tax revenues.
Yeah, and so just to push you a little bit further on that, so one of the ideas that's been floating around areas of the right in recent years is this claim that sort of the median voter in the country might be socially conservative, but they're actually more left-wing on economics, and that they don't really mind a bigger state so long as, or higher taxes so long as they get more and better public services. And even, there's areas in which the very term Thatcherism is seen as a dirty word.
Yes.
And so, what do you make of that argument and people who say that?
Well, I'd ask them to read the book. I mean, people like you and me just have to state the case over and over again until it becomes blindingly proved. For a decade now, I've been writing a thing that I vaingloriously called the Moynihan curve, which said that if you look at every country, there's a level of tax that the people in it are prepared to pay, and there's a ceiling, and the ceiling's different. In France, the ceiling is about 50%. French appear to be prepared to pay 50% of their GDP in taxes, and that's the solidarité, égalité, fraternité, all that stuff. And you actually look at the French national character as revealed in various psychometric analyses, and a man called Hofstadter who analysed national character in all European countries. And you discover that the French are very different from the rest of Europe in that respect. Now, in the UK, not only are we also different from the rest of Europe, we're right at the other end of the spectrum from France. There are just two countries like us. One is us and one is Ireland, interestingly, which has incredibly low taxes and, of course, has done incredibly well. The Irish economy is grown like a weed in the past decade. But we in the Irish have a different personality level. That means that the Moynihan curve for the UK is around 36%. We somehow, one way or the other, refuse to pay taxes more than about 36% of GDP. And you say, well, how can that be? And you were mentioning everybody seems to be aligned with this idea that the government must provide everything, and we must tax the rich and so forth. The reason that it's 36% is because so much of our tax is paid by the top levels. The top 1% pay 30% of income tax, and the top 10% pay 60% of income tax. So it doesn't. About 54% of people in the UK receive more in benefits than they pay in income tax. So it doesn't really matter what that 54% think. They might elect left-wing governments because there are an awful lot of them, but what they do doesn't impact much what kind of tax revenues we get, because government after government has exempted more and more people from paying income tax. They pay VAT, but by the way, in the UK, we put VAT on far less products than almost any other country. Only about half of all products incur VAT, whereas over in Europe it's a much higher number. But anyway, if you raise taxes, those 1% who pay 30% of all income tax, and by the way, they also pay a huge amount of capital gains tax and corporation tax and all of that stuff, they just leave. And so do a lot of people in that 10% who pay 60% of all income tax. And also leaving are all those young high achievers that I mentioned who say, the hell to this, I'm going off to a more friendly climate that welcomes enterprise and welcomes hard work and so forth. And that's why when you raise taxes, you raise tax rates, you don't raise tax revenues, because so many people immediately flood out of this country. And there's all this stuff from Henley Associates about how we have more millionaires leaving the country than any other country in the world except China or whatever. And that's been the case for 3 or 4 years now, year after year. millionaires flooding out of the country, as well as young high achievers, as well as entrepreneurs, and on and on. If you think about Australia, they don't have inheritance tax. So if you're a rich person who's 70 years old or whatever and wants to leave all your money to your kids, in particular, if you want to leave your business to your kids without having to break up the business to pay inheritance tax, off you go to Australia, and after a few years, if you die, not immediately, but after a few years, there'll be no inheritance tax. And a lot of people love their children and love their family so much that they're very willing to up sticks and move to Australia from the UK in order to secure that. Might move to Dubai or wherever, might move to a country that has inheritance tax but allows you to put your company in a trust so that it doesn't matter, and so on. You can't sit there as a smug lefty in this country and say, those people, we're going to do them because how dare they be rich, how dare they have succeeded, how dare they have worked hard all their lives, we're going to take from them. But unfortunately, you can't do that because in the main, enough people will leave when you do that to mean that you don't get what you hope to get from increasing tax rates. Of course, farms are different because farms, you can't move a farm out of the country. But that again will be catastrophic for those families who farm the land sometimes for centuries and who are going to have to break up their farms in order to find the inheritance tax on their death. And, that's really sad. You feel really sorry for these farmers. What have they done to incur this? They've looked after the land, sometimes for centuries, and now, it's going to be bought up by some, agricultural monstrosity that will leave a whole bunch of the country inheritance behind.
Yeah, it seems absolutely punitive, doesn't it? Okay, and so let's move on to something you alluded to at the start, actually, and that's the comparison with the Liz Truss budget and how it was reacted to. Because, there's plenty of fiscal incontinence in this budget, actually. And yet the IMF has come in and basically given it its stamp of approval. And similarly, much of the reaction in the media has been generally sort of, this is fine. And so what do you make of that? It's almost as if there's something in the culture which is much more well-disposed towards tax rises than tax cuts.
Yeah, I talk about this in volume 2 of the book, which is due out in January. And I talk about the madness of crowded WhatsApp groups and government by WhatsApp group. It does seem that there is a general consensus behind the scenes, and you occasionally get a glimpse into this. Everybody's talking on WhatsApp groups, and they're pals. They're not necessarily work colleagues, and you will get the institutions. You will get the academy, you will get the international bodies, all of which exchange personnel backwards and forwards, that you go out of MIT and into the IMF and onto the Bank of England or the Treasury in the US and back again to the LSE. They all talk to each other, and it's uncanny how you get the same phrase suddenly appearing overnight in public pronouncements from different institutions. The one that was so laughable was "Build Back Better," if you remember that. Suddenly, every bleeding institution, from the World Bank to to the Bank of England, to Boris Johnson, to Hillary Clinton, whatever, we're all using the phrase "build back better." But you can see that over and over again in the reaction to different budgets. So, for example, the IMF shrieked with maidenly terror when Kwasi Kwarteng produced his budget, and bizarrely, when Javier Milei did similar stuff down in Argentina, they were tremendously positive about it and said how great he would be. I don't quite know how he managed to get them on side, but again, they've been positive about Rachel Reeves's budget. For why it is so unclear, because it is really so easy to straightforwardly lay out in numbers why that budget is, in your words, incontinent. But there does just seem to be this huge consensus across the world for what you might call the social democrat approach to government. Large expenditures, high taxes, lots of regulation. And why? In my book, right at the beginning of the book that you can see perching coyly behind me, I show a map of the world coloured by economic growth. And it's absolutely straightforward. The larger the size of government in a country, the more the lousy growth it has. Or across the EU, you've got orange and red showing low or no growth. But around the world, you can see lots and lots of green, where small governments, small-sized governments, are growing the economy like a weed. And by the way, these are governments of many countries that are significantly larger GDP per capita than us. The example that I give in this book, and in particular in the upcoming volume 2, the one that is most fascinating is Switzerland, because everybody thinks of it as this rather dozy, stolid country. But last week in The Economist, they published a list of how innovative countries were in terms of the number of innovations per capita each country produces. And you can see that through, patents filed and all of that. Switzerland is the most innovative country in the world. And they have to be, because what they do is they're on a virtuous circle whereby they export like mad. They move into higher and higher value-added sectors and leave lower value-added sectors behind. So that, for example, over the past decade, their currency has appreciated threefold against the dollar. That means to say an iPad costs 1/3 to buy if you earn your money in Swiss francs, or than it would if your currency hadn't appreciated threefold. So all these wonderful consumer goods that are actually the fruit of economic growth are enjoyed by Swiss citizens at 1/3 the price that they would have if they weren't doing so well. And it's through all of that innovation that they force on themselves through market discipline. And life is hell for a Swiss exporter. If your Swiss franc is appreciated threefold, then how the hell are you going to sell your exports for 3 times as much as they would otherwise have been? Well, they have to, and they manage it by being incredibly innovative, only by being in those sectors where they can be innovative. So Switzerland, absolutely fascinating. People don't really focus on what's going on in Switzerland as much as they could, as they probably should. But Switzerland, Singapore, Dubai, Australia, the United States, country after country, more innovative, more dynamic. Why? Because their government is smaller, their regulation is less, their taxes are lower, and people can get on with innovating and growing businesses. And all of those countries I mentioned are now significantly richer than we are. 20 years ago, if we had grown at the same rate we were growing back in the year 2000 under Tony Blair, for the last 20, 25 years, we would now be as wealthy as they. We would now be, salaries would be 50% higher than what they are now. Instead of which the average wage is now 5% lower than it was 17 years ago. The average person in this country is earning 5% less in real terms than they were 17 years ago. And they know it. And that's why everybody's so fed up, particularly up north where this is most prevalent. But, down here in the metropolis in London, things like City of London preclude people from really understanding that. But it's all because we have failed to grow as an economy, while others all around the world have.
Okay, and so final question. If you were Chancellor and there was one thing you could do to improve things, what would you do?
I mean, there's so many that you could come up with, but possibly the biggest one in terms of spend and taxes is to put up a rule that says, here's the percentage of the economy that we will pay in welfare, and we'll never go above it. And we'll only, therefore, spend more on welfare if the economy grows. And it's a lot less than we've got now, which means that the payments per head that people get go down until we can grow the economy or until people come off welfare. And accompanying all of that will be, for example, I think there are several hundred people a week signing on at the moment with disability on mental health. And that mental health is stress/anxiety/depression, which many people would argue can be best helped by somebody having a job and getting the satisfaction that comes from working and earning, instead of which we pay people not to have a job and sit at home, which is not necessarily a great cure for depression and anxiety and stress. So if you could make it a lot more difficult for people to sign on, and they've indicated that they will, but I don't think they are actually taking any steps to make that happen. But if they do, I think that could help a lot. But it would only be one of dozens of things that they need to change if we're to get back to growth in this country.
Well, we live in hope. Okay, well, Jon Moynihan, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, Laurie. Good talking.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.